Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Friday, May 24th, 2024. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. Blinken wants an escalation of the Ukraine proxy war. So Secretary of State Antony Blinken is leading a push within the Biden administration to allow Ukraine to use U.S.-provided missile systems and other weapons to hit Russian territory. And this was reported by the New York Times. So similar to the story I covered yesterday, that was the House Speaker, Mike Johnson, saying that he believes Ukraine should be able to use the U.S. missiles to hit Russian territory. But now we have news that Blinken is leading a push within the administration, which makes this, to me, seem like it's much more likely to happen now. The report said that there is a vigorous debate within the administration in the wake of Russia's new offensive in Kharkiv, which was launched from over the border in Russia's Belgorod Oblast. It's unclear right now how many other high-level U.S. officials agree with Blinken, whether or not Sullivan agrees with him or what Lloyd Austin thinks. We don't really know that. But we do know that the pressure is growing for the U.S. to let Ukraine use these missiles to hit Russian territory. And according to the New York Times, this was their language, was that this is a ban that President Biden has on a restriction on Ukraine's use of U.S. weapons. And the purpose is to avoid World War III. And then I just mentioned again that you have the House Speaker and now many other members of Congress. I saw that the hearings this week, you had a lot of them, kind of grilling Blinken about this. Why can't they use weapons here? Why can't they hit Russian territory? And Victoria Nuland made a media appearance this week. I believe it was her first appearance since she stepped down in March from the State Department. And of course, Victoria Nuland, just about as hawkish as you can get, total neocon. I'm sure most of you are very familiar with her. But she is the one that was, implicated in the 2014 coup in Kiev. But she said in this interview on ABC News, quote, "I think there's also a question of whether we, the United States and our allies, ought to give them more help in hitting Russian bases, which heretofore we have not been willing to do. I think if the attacks are coming directly from over the line in Russia, that those bases ought to be fair game, whether they are where missiles are being launched from or where they are where troops are being supplied from," end quote. So this is kind of the argument now. There's not, Russia's not going to, there's not going to be some big escalation from Russia if Ukraine starts using these missiles on their territory. Don't worry about it. Even though Russia just recently warned the UK that if Ukraine uses British missiles to hit Russian territory, then they would strike British military targets in retaliation. And you also see this from kind of these think tankers and everything in the U.S. that want escalation after escalation in this proxy war. They say that Russia hasn't escalated in response to attacks on its territory. That's not true at all. They just haven't escalated in a way that's affected these people. They just speaking recently, there's other things that have happened throughout the past 2 years. Ukraine started hitting oil refineries inside of Russia. Russia responded by launching massive attacks on Ukrainian energy infrastructure, putting a lot of Ukrainians in the dark. But that's not something, if you work at the Atlantic Council, that's not something that you have to deal with. Also, this Kharkiv offensive, Putin says this is a response to all these Ukrainian attacks in Belgorod to create a buffer zone. I believe he even said they don't want to capture the city Kharkiv. So you have Russia saying that this offensive is a direct response to Ukrainian attacks inside Russia, and now you have Blinken and everybody, Nuland, saying, all right, well, let's give Ukraine the ability to hit them even harder inside of Russia. And Ukraine has been hitting civilian areas, residential areas with drones in Belgrade. So is it possible that they start using HIMARS for attacks like that? It's just complete insanity where we're at right now with everything that's happening in Ukraine. No chance of victory, but they just want to keep climbing that escalation ladder. All right, so the next one here. Putin decree allows the seizure of U.S. assets if Russian funds are taken. So Russian President Vladimir Putin signed a decree on Thursday that will allow the seizure of any U.S. assets in Russia to compensate for any Russian assets that are taken by the U.S. So this could be applied to any American individuals or companies that have assets in Russia. And this came after President Biden signed a bill into law giving him the power to confiscate Russian assets and use them to pay for aid to Ukraine, or use them, or just give the money to Ukraine. And there is the Russian central bank assets that have been frozen by the U.S. and its allies, about $300 billion worth. The majority is frozen in Europe. I remember reading reports earlier that said that there's about $60 billion frozen by the U.S. Federal Reserve. But everything lately has been saying that there's only $5 billion that the U.S. can access. And then I looked closer and saw that it was $60 billion in U.S. dollar reserves. So maybe that's not all held by the Fed. But anyway, this is, Russia getting ready to respond if the U.S. goes to take this step. So Putin's decree would allow the Russian central bank or any companies that lost assets in the U.S. to apply to Russian courts with a claim to establish that they lost assets, due to a decision by the U.S., and then they'll be compensated if, there's enough American assets in Russia that they could do that with. I'm not really sure how many there are. And the U.S. is not expected to go ahead with this plan unless their allies agree to do so as well, since, again, the vast majority of the money's in Europe. The EU, they are planning to give Ukraine about $3 billion per year using the profits made by Russian assets. And Russia is warning that it will retaliate to that as well. We don't know exactly what that retaliation might be. But Ukraine has said that the $3 billion per year amounts to almost nothing, and they are demanding that the West hand over all the Russian assets, all the hundreds of billions of dollars. So this would be an unprecedented, stealing Russian assets and giving them to Ukraine would be a pretty unprecedented move here. It would mark a very big escalation in, the economic campaign against Moscow. And you have Western banks are warning that this could undermine trust in the Western banking system. And I think this is something that could kind of speed up the de-dollarization that we're seeing. So, it's just a bad idea all around here, but anything to keep this proxy war going. All right, so the next one here, the ICJ could order a halt of Israel's military operations. So Israeli officials are worried that the International Court of Justice will order a halt to military operations in Gaza, as the court is set to rule on an emergency request from South Africa over the Israeli assault on Rafah. So as part of its genocide case against Israel, South Africa asked the ICJ last week to order a halt to Israel's attack on Rafah and an end to the Israeli military operation altogether in Gaza altogether. So a lawyer for South Africa said at the hearing last week, quote, "It was Rafah that brought South Africa to the court, but it is all Palestinians as a national, ethnic, and racial group who need the protection from genocide that the court can order," end quote. So multiple Israeli media outlets have reported that Israel expects the court to oblige South Africa's request to some extent, whether it's in order for them to withdraw from Rafah or in order for them to halt all military operations. And right now, things have been really escalating. We'll see in another story the strikes just across Gaza in the north and central Gaza in the south. And, what they did order, because South Africa, when they first brought the genocide case, they did ask for an emergency ruling for in order to halt the military operations. The ICJ didn't do that, but they said Israel must basically not do anything against the Genocide Convention and not kill a lot of Palestinians, or I forget the exact wording, but it didn't impact Israel's military operations at all. And so Israeli officials have made clear that they would not follow any ruling from the ICJ, with a government spokesperson telling Reuters that no power on earth can stop Israel. But this ruling, if the ICJ ruled this would really increase, this international pressure on Israel that keeps growing and growing. And that means that the pressure on the U.S. will also grow. Israel Hayom reported that a significant concern among Israeli officials is that an injunction from the ICJ would lead to a UN Security Council resolution. So if the ICJ says, halt your military operations, and then the Security Council tries to pass a resolution, that would probably pass unless Israel can get the U.S. to veto another one. So this would be, right now you have the ICC warrants, you have the ICJ genocide case overall. They ruled that it's plausible Israel's committing genocide. The final ruling on that probably won't happen for a few years, but all this stuff going on, all this, it just, again, you see the U.S. for the past few years lecture Russia, try to use the ICC against Russia and all this stuff, and now just giving cover to Israel as they're just committing this slaughter in Gaza. So we'll see what happens. Again, this is Friday, so it probably wouldn't be too long after this show is posted that we'll find out. All right, so the next one here. 3 U.S. troops suffer non-combat injuries in Gaza Pier operation. So the U.S. military said on Thursday that 3 U.S. troops suffered non-combat related injuries while working on the U.S. Pier operation off the coast of the Gaza Strip. So Vice Admiral Bradley Cooper, he's the deputy commander of U.S. Central Command, he said that 2 of the troops suffered minor injuries, with one rolling an ankle and the other hurting their back. The 3rd service member had a severe enough injury to require medical evacuation to an Israeli hospital, but Cooper did not elaborate on what the injury was. So while you have the Pentagon saying that these injuries were non-combat related, the incident certainly highlights, the danger of this deployment. There's about 1,000 U.S. troops working just off the coast of Gaza. That puts them in the range of Hamas rockets. And Hamas and other Palestinian militants view the U.S. as a party to the conflict because they've provided Israel with most of the bombs that have been dropped on Gaza. And we had Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin acknowledge that there is a risk of U.S. troops deployed for the Pier mission coming under attack, and said that they would be able to shoot back. So what would happen, if there is a big attack on this pier and some Americans die? What's going to happen next? The news of these injuries comes as aid deliveries through the pier apparently resumed after the operation got off to a pretty bad start. So we'll see if this is successful at all. They had a few trucks came off the pier, and then some of it got diverted and looted. But they're going to try again. And this pier cost $320 million. It's just completely crazy. Instead of pressuring Israel to open more land crossings, Biden went ahead and did this, which it really puts the U.S. at risk here of an attack. Again, just right off the coast there. So it's just, there's a lot to say about it, but we'll see if the aid starts going through there consistently or not. But either way, they're saying that the total trucks that they think they can get through that pier is like 90 per day, which is less than you can get through a border crossing in a day, if the trucks were really coming. All right, so the next one here, Israeli forces kill dozens of Palestinians in strikes across Gaza. So this article is from Al Jazeera, and it says Israeli forces have killed at least 50 Palestinians in aerial and ground bombardments across the Gaza Strip and battled in close combat with Hamas-led fighters in the southern Gaza city of Rafah, health officials and the armed wing of Hamas say. So Israeli tanks advanced in Rafah's southeast, edged towards the city's western district of Yibna, and continued to operate in 3 eastern suburbs, residents said on Thursday. One resident told Reuters, quote, "The occupation is trying to move farther to the west. They are on the edge of Yibna, which is densely populated. They didn't invade it yet. We hear explosions and we see black smoke coming up from the areas where the army has invaded, it was another very difficult night, end quote. Simultaneous Israeli assaults on the northern and southern edges of Gaza this month have caused a new exodus of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians fleeing their homes and have cut off the main access routes for aid, raising the risk of famine. So 50, again, there's been the fighting in Jabalia. Israeli forces stepped up a ground offensive in northern Gaza's Jabalia refugee camp, where the military has razed several residential areas. It has also struck the nearby town of Beit Hanun. Israel previously declared major operations over in these areas. They declared major operations were over in these areas months ago, but say that they had to return to prevent Hamas from regrouping there. At least 12 Palestinians were killed in an airstrike on a store belonging to the welfare ministry east of Deir el-Bala in the central Gaza Strip. So again, in the north, in central Gaza, and in the south. So I think this could make it more likely that the ICJ might rule, might order a halt to the military operations. All right, so the next one here, Palestinians stranded in Gaza after paying Egypt $5,000 each to flee. This article is from the Middle East Eye. The Rafah crossing between Egypt and Gaza has been closed indefinitely since the Israeli military seized the crossing on May 7th, a closure which has left thousands of Palestinians in limbo. Since the beginning of Israel's war on Gaza in October and the subsequent closure of all other crossings, the Rafah crossing with Egypt has been the only passageway for civilians fleeing the conflict. An Egyptian company with exclusive control on exits and transfers via the terminal had been charging Palestinians at least $5,000 per adult and $2,500 per child to cross to the Egyptian side. So that's a lot of money for families in Gaza. Apparently, they made at least $2 million per day, one of these companies that were charging them. Now, those who were due to travel in May, so there's Palestinians who got the money together and paid to leave, and now they're stuck because the Rafah border crossing has been closed since Israel captured it. And they spoke with someone who paid $20,000 to get the family out, said that he borrowed the money, sold his car and all his electronic goods, and now he's stuck and he can't get out. And I know earlier it was like $20,000 per person to get out. But now they're totally in limbo. All right, so the next one here, Israel to restore West Bank settlements that were left in 2005. So Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant announced on Wednesday the broadening of a law that will allow Israelis to return to 3 settlements in the occupied West Bank that were dismantled in 2005. So in 2005, 4 settlements were dismantled in the West Bank and 21 were dismantled in Gaza. And this is a move that was known as the disengagement. And last year, the Israeli Knesset passed an amendment to the disengagement law, allowing the return to 1 West Bank settlement. And Gallant's move allows settlers to return to the entire area, which is located in the northern West Bank between the Palestinian cities of Nablus and Jenin. Announcing the move, Gallant vowed to do what he could to continue expanding West Bank settlements. He said, quote, "Just as I have done in every position I've held in government, I will continue to foster the settlement of Judea and Samaria," end quote. And that is the biblical name for the West Bank. So Gallant's announcement came on the same day that Spain, Norway, and Ireland said that they would recognize Palestine as a state. And the settlers, there's over 500,000 Israeli settlers in the West Bank, and the settlements and the expansion of settlements, that's, really the main impediment to a 2-state solution. That and Israel's refusal, Netanyahu's refusal to give them a state, of course. But, the expansion of settlements, this is something that, the U.S. claims it's opposed to, but of course they continue to give all this military aid to Israel every year, even as they have significantly expanded settlements in the past few years. And it was this current government, the Netanyahu coalition, that came into power in December 2022, when they released a statement vowing to prioritize the expansion of the West Bank settlements with the ultimate goal of annexing the territory. And settlers have very influential positions in the government. You have Bezalel Smotrich. He's the finance minister, and he's also a minister. He has a minister position in the defense ministry that basically makes him like the occupation governor of the West Bank. And in that position, he has the power to expand settlements, demolish Palestinian homes. And after this government took power, violence against Palestinians in the West Bank really skyrocketed. The military stepped up raids in the West Bank, and settlers became more emboldened and more violent. And as a result, 2023 was the deadliest year for Palestinians in the West Bank since the early 2000s, before October 7th. And even before October 7th, it was the deadliest year for Palestinians in the West Bank since the early 2000s. And then since October 7th, it's gotten even worse, and the settlers have been on rampages. And there's been a lot of Israeli raids, some that, I should be covering that stuff more. It gets overshadowed by Gaza, of course, but some big Israeli raids are happening. So since October 7th, over 500 Palestinians have been killed in the West Bank, killed by soldiers and settlers. And this is the West Bank. Hamas is not in the West Bank. This is something that on the face of it, even a lot of Israel supporters and defenders in the U.S. try not to really talk about the West Bank, the settlers, because there's no, that's just them. They're just trying to take people's land, take people's houses, and because they believe that they have a right to the land because of their religion, and they think that the people they're, taking the land from shouldn't have any property rights or rights at all, really, in that area. You have guys like Smotrich and everything who openly call for, the expulsion of Palestinians. And of course, they all want to settle Gaza now as well. All right. So the next one here, Israeli strike in Lebanon kills teacher and wounds school children. So this one is from Jason Ditz. Israel carried out a drone strike in Nabatea today, and this was on Thursday. I probably pronounced that town wrong. I really need to look up my Lebanese towns before I read these stories. So this was about 6 miles from the Israeli border in southern Lebanon. The strike targeted and killed a 35-year-old physics teacher named Mohammed Ali Farhan. He was also a reservist for Hezbollah, but he's a school teacher, and he was the target in this strike. And a school bus that was passing by at the time of the attack was also hit. The shattered glass in the bus wounded at least 3 school children, according to reports, and the children were taken to a hospital. Israel is claiming that he was a military commander. Hezbollah confirmed that he was killed. But there wasn't really any other details about him from Hezbollah. Israel's claiming he's a commander. I don't know if that's really true. And there's some numbers in here. So since Israeli strikes on Lebanon began in October, at least 425 people have been killed, including at least 82 civilians. So actually, let's think about that. I'm covering these drone strikes, these airstrikes in Lebanon almost every day lately. And more people have been killed in the West Bank. Again, it shows that I'm kind of been neglecting that, covering that. But, it's a big number for these Israeli strikes in southern Lebanon. All right, so the next one here, U.S. House Committee proposes an automatic draft sign-up. So this article is from Edward Hasbrook. On Wednesday, during the markup of the National Defense Authorization Act for the fiscal year 2025, the U.S. House Armed Services Committee approved an amendment to the NDAA that would automatically register all draft-aged male U.S. residents with the Selective Service System for a possible military draft based on information from other federal databases. This system of automatic draft registration would replace the system in effect since 1980, in which young men can decide for themselves whether or not to sign up for the draft, and so many choose not to register that the Selective Service database would be useless for an actual draft. The automatic draft registration proposal was instigated by the Selective Service System as part of its annual budget request to Congress. So this is not, definitely not something good, whatever they have in mind here. So Representative Chrissy Houlihan, who's a Democrat from Pennsylvania, has been one of the leading proponents of proposals in previous years to expand draft registration to women as well as men. And this is the representative that was introduced the budget request from the Selective Service System, so pushing this idea for the automatic registration. It's almost like, we probably can't imagine like a real draft happening right now, but when we talk about long term and the things down the line, if there really is a war with China, for instance, and if it didn't turn nuclear right away, they would need a lot of bodies to fill ships, to fill destroyers, to fill aircraft carriers, although they might be toast pretty quick with the Chinese missiles, but they would need a lot of bodies for that. And that's something there could potentially be a draft for. And this stuff makes me a lot angrier now that I have, 2 kids, 2 boys. So again, they considering all the plans that they have for the future, this is definitely worrying. All right, so the next one here, Biden to make Kenya a major non-NATO ally. So this article is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. President Joe Biden announced that the U.S. would make Kenya a major non-NATO ally during President William Ruto's visit to Congress. So this gives, if countries are declared major non-NATO allies, they receive more access to U.S. weapons, to training and technology and things like that. And this appears to be an award for Kenya for agreeing to deploy this police force to Haiti, which, considering everything that's been happening with Haiti, you have these armed groups that have taken over much of the capital, and this U.S.-backed government. They have this new transitional government that the U.S. is backing, but I don't think they really are, have secured power. And the plan is for Kenya, and the U.S. is going to fund this deployment. The plan is for Kenya to deploy 1,000 police to, and I just don't know how they're going to have any sort of success in restoring order to Port-au-Prince. So, but this is what, part of it, I think, part of the U.S., again, they're funding the deployment and they're increasing ties with Kenya and going to probably give them more military aid and things like that. And apparently the 1,000 Kenyan police so the President Ruto was in Washington for a big state visit, and the Kenyan police were supposed to arrive in Haiti at the same time. They like doing symbolic things, but the deployment has been delayed. It's not with no clear timeline, and I think that's just because the reality on the ground. So we'll see when that happens, or if that actually happens. All right, so the last story here, mainland China to be tested by Taiwan under William Lai. So this is really just an analysis from the South China Morning Post that I thought was interesting about Taiwan's new president, and about how China, he's kind of going to be different than Tsai Ing-wen, his predecessor. They're both from the same political party, the Democratic Progressive Party, and they're independence leaning. They favor closer ties with the West. And it's the 3rd consecutive term for the DPP, which is a first. So I think they're kind of going to be more emboldened in what they want to do. So a Taiwan led by the newly inaugurated William Lai Ching-te will bring new challenges to the cross-strait relationship, as well as Beijing's global articulation of its policies toward the self-governed island, according to observers on either side. So Joanna Lee Chin, a former Taiwanese lawmaker from the opposition party Kuomintang, said that many assumptions on the cross-strait situation should be thrown out of the window because things have changed at an exceedingly surprising speed. She said, quote, Lai's persona, it's something that we really need to be very careful about, end quote. And so she's from Kuomintang, and Kuomintang is more friendly with mainland China and wants to ease ties and everything. So just interesting. I mean, that's kind of the gist of this article. And China did launch those drills that they're simulating a blockade of Taiwan right now to show that they're not happy with Lai. It's the biggest. I think it's the biggest drills that they've done since Nancy Pelosi went over there in 2022, and that was the first time that they simulated a blockade, and now they're doing it again. So that is it for the news for today. Please go check out our viewpoints. One from James Carden, after Raisi, the unendurable endures. One from Nick Terse, constant killing, the Pentagon's 0.00035% problem, about the U.S. killing lots of civilians in its wars over the years. One from Ramsey Baroud, Nakba resurrected, how the Gaza resistance ended segmentation of Palestine. One from Jacob Hornberger, closer to nuclear war. And one from Azam Ahmed and Mateu Akins, the U.S.-backed kidnapping, torture, and murder in Afghanistan. So this is a big investigation from the New York Times about what they call America's monster, who they backed in Abdul Razik, one of the U.S.'s most important partners in the war against the Taliban. And it's about all these disappearances and killings and torture and all this horrific stuff that this guy was involved in. America's Monster, I think, is a very apt title of this, and it's a very long investigation if you want to check out some of the horrors that the U.S. was responsible for in Afghanistan. So that's everything for me for today. That's it for the week. I hope everyone has a good weekend. You could always support this show by sharing it. Tell your friends about antiwar.com. Like, subscribe, follow us on Instagram, X, all that stuff. I'll be back in a few days. Thanks for listening.